Hey folks, welcome back to the Dice Tower preview. I'm Mark.
And I'm Randy.
Today we're taking a look at Centershaft Fallen Elements.
Centershaft Fallen Elements is brought to you by Not My Eyeball Games. It plays 2 to 4 players, ages 14 and up, and each game takes between 30 and 60 minutes to play.
Great. Well, let's go see if we can escape the curse of the labyrinth. In Centershaft, you play as one of 4 different heroes, or adventurers, or opportunists, perhaps, because you're diving into a cavern looking for ancient gemstones that have been hidden away. In this quest, though, you're going to be running into all kinds of creatures, natives, you have portals you have to deal with, and of course these gemstones have mysterious powers and an ever-changing maze that is full of traps. And in the end, it's all about getting back to the center shaft and escaping.
At the beginning of a game, you will place the center shaft tile in the middle of the table. Then players will take turns placing the labyrinth tiles, always making certain that there's a path from the tile they're placing back to the center shaft. After all the labyrinth tiles have been placed, players will then take turns placing the warp tiles, and then they will take turns placing the gemstone element tiles. Lastly, they will place sarcophagus pieces on each of the sarcophagus tiles and gemstones on each of the element tiles.
Each player will receive a character card along with a pawn. In our case, it's a pawn. However, in the final game, it will be minifigures. Each of these cards will track your health. It also will track what different element stones that you've collected, and each of the characters has a special affinity for a certain type of element. These cards also track strategic movement if you use that option during the game. Each player also receives a death right token in their color. Then you're going to take the event deck, shuffled up, put next to the board along with the rest of the tokens and the Infernal Shadow pawn, or miniature if you have the final game. And then finally, you'll take all your pawns and put them in the center shaft, ready to start the game.
The objective of each player in Centershaft is to explore the labyrinth, make it to each of the element tiles, collect an element token, and make it back to the Centershaft with all 4 element tokens and escape before any of the other players do. They will do this by taking turns consisting of 2 phases. The first phase of a turn is called the event phase. The second phase is the movement phase. During the event phase, you will take the top card of the event deck. And cards in the event deck come in 4 different types. The first is called an encounter card. And what you'll see here is a triangle on the left side with an 8 in it, and it'll come in 4 different colors, each color corresponding to a specific element. You'll see here the need to roll a 12-sided die, and if you score 8 or above, you get the bonus listed. And sometimes they're very good bonuses. But if you do not, you lose the rest of your turn, so you won't get to move yourself this turn. Now, there's this affinity down here. So if your character has an affinity to the element shown on the card, you actually get to add 2 to your dice roll. So when you get these aren't necessarily a bad thing. If it happens to correspond to your character's affinity, you're probably going to be luckier than other characters. Indeed. But the bonus on these can be very powerful. The next type of card is called a trap card, and it's similar to the encounter card in the sense that there's a number here on the left, but instead of an 8, it will be a 4. And this number doesn't have any specific element affinity. This trap requires you to roll a d12 as well, but there's no +2. There's no benefit of any particular affinity here. And like the event card or encounter card, you'll see a circle in the card with a lightning bolt on it. And in both cases, that means that this effect happens immediately. And we'll talk about other type of effects in a second. But there's also a bonus here if you roll the number required or above. And there's also a penalty. Now, these penalties might impact just you, like mini traps, and sometimes they impact all players on the board. So don't be certain that this is only going to be bad news for you if you don't make the roll.
Bad news for everybody.
It could be bad news for everybody. The next type of card is called a hazard card, and there's 2 types of hazard card. One actually inflicts 1 damage on you, and it's the Thorny Grasp, and the other one, it requires you to lose the rest of your turn. So once again, you'll lose your movement phase. So there's lots of bad things happening in the labyrinth here, but don't lose hope. There's also a lot of good things here, because the 4th type of card is called an item card. Item cards, you'll see a different symbol here in the circle. Instead of seeing a lightning bolt, you'll see either a star, which indicates that you can keep this and use it once sometime in the future, or this kind of circular symbol here with 2 arrows going in a circle that says you can keep it in front of you and it's an ongoing effect. So these items are very powerful. This one, for example, the Amulet of Grace, is an ongoing effect, and it adds 2 to your movement roll each turn.
Which is great.
It's very, very good.
But let's talk about what that ring does.
Let's talk about the ring.
There's a healthy amount of take that in this
There
game.
is, and so once you have these in front of you, it doesn't guarantee you're going to get to keep them long term. Now, some of these, as we said, you use them once and you discard them. But just because they're in front of you and you haven't used them, there are other cards like this one, which is the thieving ring, and it's got the star, which means that, let's say I got this and I kept it until I wanted it. I wanted to use it. Say Mark also got a thieving ring. He could use his thieving ring to steal my thieving ring, or any of the other items I have in front of me. So when you use these is very important. Sometimes you want to use them quickly so that they don't get stolen. There's also a scepter, I think, that breaks items.
Yeah, right.
And these don't have to be used on a player anywhere near you. These can be used on any player, anywhere around the board, anytime on your turn.
Very magical.
They are. Now, one thing Mark mentioned earlier in the kind of the prologue or description of the game is that there's this shifting labyrinth.
Yes.
And so this dimensional shift card allows you to move some tiles on the board. This one says move any tile to any other place in the labyrinth. And this still requires you to make certain that the paths connect back to the center shaft, but it can change radically, and especially if the tile you're moving has people on it.
Indeed.
And then also, since you only have 3 health, there are cards that give you additional health. Now, these are only 4 of the many items in the game.
Yeah,
and
there's a lot.
There's a lot. And so this is the thing that makes the event part of the game, or event phase of a turn, a fun part. Because in general, you're going to be drawing one of these items, but there are occasions when you draw one of the encounters, or the traps, or the hazard cards.
Now let's take a look at the movement phase. And there are 2 types of movement in this game, and you have to decide up front at the beginning of the game which one you're going to use. You have variable and you have strategic. Variable is just taking the 12-sided dice and rolling it, and that's your movement point for that turn. However, strategic, which I think we kind of like better, is the fact that you have 4 different movement numbers to work with. You've got 3, 6, 9, and 12, and you strategically use these numbers for each turn. And as you use them, you cover them up, and they're not available until you've cycled through all the different numbers. And once you do, then you get all those back, and you get a new fresh start, so to say, right? And those are the 2 different types of movement, and it's just how you move through the dungeon.
Yeah, and it can be very key in deciding whether you want to use that 3 now, or you want to use the 12 right immediately. Keeping in mind that when you move, you must use all your movement points. So you say, well, I need to get to that gemstone, and do I use my 12 now, knowing that it's as important that I get out and get to the next one as it is for me to get there to begin with. So there's a lot of key decisions with the strategic movement phase.
Now, there are several special tiles to make note of. To start off, we're going to take a look at the arrow tile and the pressure plate tile. These work together no matter where they are in the dungeon. Whoever steps on the pressure plate will trigger the arrow tile, and if anyone's in the arrow tile, they lose 1 health. Next, let's take a look at the sarcophagus tile. And on this tile in the middle, you have the stone, the sarcophagus, that you're going to be potentially landing on. And if you do land on it, then you have to make a die check. You have to roll a 12-sided dice, and there's a varying number of things that can happen. You can lose health, you can gain health, you can teleport, and so forth. But they give you this nice reference sheet to roll against, and everyone knows what's going to happen. And you remove that sarcophagus from the tile, and that tile is then free to move through without problems.
Right. Now, you can walk around the sarcophagus if you want to, but many times what's attracting you to that tile, or tempting you to open the sarcophagus, is the fact that you can recover full health if you roll correctly.
Indeed.
Or teleport someplace. Both of those are very powerful options. The sad thing is that if you're down to 1 health and you're looking for health there, you also have the possibility of getting the mummy punching you in the face and you dying at that point.
Absolutely. Next, let's take a look at the Labyrinth Guardian tile. And this is designated by a coiled tentacle. And what happens here is you move into this tile and you move into the coiled tentacle, you basically not lose your turn, but you lose your movement at that point.
Yeah, the rest of your movement for that turn.
So it kind of locks you into place until next turn. And then you have the open tentacle tile. And this one is very interesting because you can only move through this tile if you have enough movement points to do so. Otherwise, you cannot enter the tile at all.
So there are other types of tiles that are very conspicuous by the fact that their colors are so different.
Right?
These are called the warp tiles, and these are the ones that are numbered 1 through 4. If you move onto one of these tiles into the center space of that tile, you move into the center of the warp tile next in sequence. So for example, if you landed on the 2 and that warp tile, you would move to the center space of the 3 tile, 3 to 4, and of course 4 back to 1. So these are ones that you move to potentially if you want to get from one side of the board to the other quickly. Now there's another case when the warp tiles are used, and that is if you move to the center of the Centershaft tile. Players, beginning with the last player in the first round, players who land there have the option of rolling a 12-sided die, and based upon their roll, they teleport to one of those 4 locations. Now, you might say, why would I ever want to do that? And the reason is, if you're the last player to move, you say, wow, everybody's gotten a head start. Maybe I'm just going to just go there and see where I end up, and maybe it gives me a head start because it ports me to close to one of the other tiles, one of the gem tiles.
And then finally we have element tiles. And this is really kind of the heart of the game because you're trying to get those element stones and get out. So you move to whatever element that you particularly need, and you're going to go grab the token from that element tile. Now, there's also a gemstone in the middle. And if you land on the gemstone, it gives you special powers. So let's take a closer look at those special powers. So if you possess one of these gemstones, you have power. And so you have fire, air, water, and earth. So with fire, you can cause damage to another player. With air, you can steal items from other players. With earth, you're going to be pushing people, right? And with water, you can possibly cause them to lose their turn for the next turn. And a lot of these powers, basically, you have to be next to the other player. However, if you have an affinity for one of these specific gemstone types or elements, then as long as you're on the same tile, you can use that power against a player on the tile.
Now, you can end up with several gemstones in your possession. And the things that makes these powerful is not just the powers themselves, but the fact that on each turn, you can use them against each other player that's in proximity. So you might be able to use, if you have a couple players right next to you, you can use all of them, the gems you own, against each of those players. And maybe there's someone on the other side of the tile. If you have one of the stones for which you have an affinity, you can use that stone against them as well.
And it's important to note that these gemstones give you those powers, but they're not required to win, right? Really, you need those element tokens. That's the key.
Right. So if you end up in an element tile and the gem's already been stolen because Mark's been there before you, that doesn't keep you from getting the required token for that element and escaping. And in fact, in the game we played, we found that Mark had, how many did you have? 3? You had 3 of them. But I was running all over the place just snatching up the tokens. And so even though Mark was far more powerful, I just tried to avoid him as much as I could.
It worked really well.
It worked really well. I got back to the Centershaft in time. So that's the trade-off, because in some cases you want the power, but in other cases maybe you just want to run and not worry about tracking down that gemstone.
Now, we've been talking about the movement phase. There is potential based on card effects that you have lost your movement. And what happens then is that you get to control the Infernal Shadow. And if she's not in play yet, then you will move her to the Centershaft and roll a d6 to move her. And regardless of wherever she is in the dungeon, you will always roll a d6 to move her. Now, it's important to note that she doesn't follow the standard cobblestone path along the dungeon tiles. Instead, she moves a tile at a time. So in general, she can pretty much hang out anywhere on the specific tile she lands on. Now, if you move her onto a tile with other players, then she will attack them basically. And if they don't have a gemstone, she will teleport them away. But if they do have gemstones, then she will use whatever gemstones they have against that player, which is brutal.
It is.
Right? So again, those gemstones can be a negative, right?
Yeah, I was very disappointed that the Infernal
didn't come after
you. Yeah.
Because I had so many of them. And then she stays out on the board and is in play for the rest of the game. However, card effects and gemstones and things will not affect her.
Right.
She's just a spectral ghost, basically.
As we said before, you start the game with 3 health, and there's a lot of hazards and threats in the labyrinth that might cause you to lose all 3 of them. And if that's the case, what happens is that you take your characters, the element tokens your character has collected, and you put those back in the supply. You take all of the gems and the item cards that you have and put them aside near your player board. and you put this death right token that each player has, according to his color, on the spot where you died. And then you move your marker, your pawn or your miniature figure, back to the center shaft tile. Now, whoever gets back to that spot gets to collect any gems or any items that you left behind, including you. So you might go there and get your corpse's remnants there.
However, your element tokens are gone.
Yeah, they're permanently gone. So you've returned those to the supply, and you have to start the collection all over again.
So, as we said before, the first person who collects all 4 element tokens and makes it back to the center shaft will win the game. Alright folks, just a reminder once again, this has been a Dice Tower paid preview, and everything you've seen here has been in prototype form. So keep a close eye on the campaign for any changes that still may occur. Now with that said, you know, the tiles they've already made changes to. The new versions have some nice outlines showing you a little bit better how movement works through each tile to the next, and how it'll help with lining things up as well. And I think the thing I like is how the whole labyrinth can shift and change. I like that aspect a lot.
Yeah, and I'm glad they're making the changes to make a little bit more contrast in the tiles, but I already like the artwork there.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you can tell from the film, but right now we have glossy tiles in the prototype, and they're going to make that a matte finish, so it's going to be much easier to see and avoid any sort of glare there.
Indeed. All right, so ultimately, folks, if this looks like a game that would be of interest to you, I'm sure they would appreciate your support.
That's right.
I think that's it from us. And until next time, we'll see you at the table.
Thanks so much for watching the Dice Tower videos. Find more great videos and reviews, as well as our top-rated audio podcast at Dicetower.com. You can also find other great shows at Dicetowernetwork.com. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching The Dice Tower. The Dice Tower is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc., where you can find great games for great prices. Cool stuff in stock. Check them out at CoolStuffInc.com.